the Civil War and World War II, black Southerners were no longer slaves, but they were not yet free. What happened in that period of time was so much more terrible than anything most Americans recognize or understand today. In one of the most shameful chapters of American history, generations of black Southerners were forced to labor against their will.
Free black people could be just picked up and put in jail. The sheriff department could sell people to corporations and gold mines.
He locked me up for 3 days. And after that, he said, if I don't go to work, he'll put me in the river down there.
People's lives were truly stolen from them. Their freedom was taken away.
All the southern states used the criminal justice system to put African Americans back into a position as close to slavery as they possibly could.
These were real people who were deemed to be of no value. Maybe now, through the telling of this history, these individuals can receive some measure of justice.
Probably think of the Atlantic slave trade. Or what do you think of when you hear the words slave trade? You probably think of the Atlantic slave trade. While this is one of the most well-known, there were, and still are, numerous other trades. Today, we're going to take a look at all of the different trades throughout history, with a focus on the Atlantic trade. I'm Michael Fliss 25, and these are 25 shocking facts about slave trade. One of the first mentions of slavery was in the Mesopotamian Code of Hammurabi, circa 1860 BC. It's worth noting that besides not having a written language, slavery wasn't too popular with hunter-gatherers because it required social stratification. 24. Since the beginning of civilization, post-hunter-gatherers, slavery has played a huge role in society, from the building of the pyramids in Egypt to indentured servitude in England. In fact, at the turn of the 19th century, an estimated 3/4 of the world was trapped in bondage against their will, some form of slavery or serfdom. 23. The first large-scale slave trade was the Arab slave trade. It started in the 7th century and primarily involved slaves being taken from Western Africa to the Arabian Peninsula. Some historians have cited the Arab slave trade as possibly being the initial source of prejudice against darker-skinned sub-Saharan Africans that has unfortunately continued into the 21st century. 22. When most people consider the phrase slave trade, they're thinking of the Atlantic slave trade. This slave trade started during the 15th century and continued until the 19th century. 21. As with the Arab slave trade, the source of slaves was, once again, sub-Saharan Africa. The Europeans essentially tapped into an already developed slave trade and exploited it for their own purposes. 20. The Portuguese were the first to enter the Atlantic slave trade in the 16th century. For the next 4 centuries, they would remain the primary actors. In fact, by the time it was abolished in the 19th century, nearly half of all slaves traded in the Atlantic slave trade had been shipped to Portuguese colonies like Brazil. 19. Although most people think of the slave trade as being British ships taking slaves from West Africa to the US, this only accounted for a little over 6% of all slaves. The vast majority, roughly 60%, were sent to Spanish and Portuguese South America. 18. Most of the remaining slaves, about 30%, were taken to the Caribbean by the British, French, and Dutch empires. 17. This trade wasn't just back and forth, though. It was something called triangle trade. And, as you could guess, triangular trade is any trade that involves 3 separate regions.
And as you know, it's impossible to travel back in those days, especially upstream to that place they call Africa. All the Africans don't even call it Africa. And they would have had to go from America, as you see, the starting point where the arrow point is at, and they just pointing at exactly in America where it started at, as you see where the arrow points right there, but see, they failed to mention it. So they took you from America to Spain, to the rest of the other Spaniards, and so forth. Then towards the African continent and so forth, and slavery and so forth.
In this instance, the slaves were taken from West Africa and exchanged for cash crops in the Caribbean. The cash crops were exchanged for manufactured goods in New England, and then the manufactured goods were once again exchanged for slaves in West Africa. 16. Although the British North American colonies were not a major destination region for slaves, apart from the plantations in the South, the colonies benefited massively from selling their manufactured goods to slave traders. 15. Historians estimate that approximately 12 million African slaves entered the Atlantic trade between the 16th and 19th centuries. About 1.5 million died on the ships during transport, and 10.5 million were sold into slavery, mostly in the Caribbean. Another 6 million were sold to Asian slave traders, and yet another 8 million were destined for slave markets on the continent of Africa itself. 14. About 4 million more slaves died during forced marches to the coasts of Africa. Since Europeans typically were afraid to venture too far inland due to disease, slaves were brought to the coasts to be sold by slave traders or opposing tribes. 13. With the
Now, you see how they cut out the bag? If they took you from Africa, why was they bringing you to Africa to be sold as slaves? Exactly, because they took you from America to the Spaniards, Portuguese, and then all around the world to be slaves.
arrival of European slave ships, criminals and prisoners of war were typically sold to the Europeans for money rather than being punished as they used to be. 12. Once at the coast, slaves were held in large forts called factories. Out of the 20 million slaves who passed through the factory doors, historians estimate that roughly 4% died there, about 820,000 people. 11. Slave ship captains packed anywhere between 350 to 600 people onto their boats.
Not true. 100 to 150 at the most. Okay. And you can guarantee just about 50 of them died from abuse, slavery abuse, every single time. So they're lying on the numbers. It's like they added 1,000 years to our time date. I told you the same story two, 3 times over, and then put Mr. J in a place of him, and then claim somebody rose from the dead, but nobody rose from the dead because the Bible says the deceiver never rose.
The quarters were so cramped that the victims could barely move on the 2-month voyage across the Atlantic. Many died of disease because they slept in their urine and feces. Others committed suicide by escaping and jumping overboard. Even sailors didn't like working on the slave ships, and many died of disease. This was good for profits, however, as the ship captains had fewer people to pay. 10. Upon arrival in the Americas, usually the Caribbean, slaves were held at seasoning camps. Dysentery was the leading cause of death here, and nearly 5 million slaves died in these camps. 9. Sugar plantations were the reason for about 84% of slaves being brought to the New World. The vast majority would end up in Brazil. 8. Britain's triangle trade between its colonies, however, was the most profitable of the Atlantic slave trades. This led to Britain becoming a massive consumer of sugar. It's estimated that nearly 1 out of every 20 pounds in circulation during the start of the Industrial Revolution was derived from the slave trade. 7. So why were Europeans buying African slaves and not vice versa? To make a long story short, it came down to one thing: technology. Although it would have been cheaper to enslave other Europeans, advances in shipbuilding technology made it possible to enter an existing market on another continent. 6. Plantations in the American South, usually less than 100 slaves, were dwarfed in size compared to plantations in the Caribbean and South America, usually more than 100 slaves. This led to high rates of disease in the larger plantations of South America. Death rates in the Caribbean and Brazil were so high and birth rates were so low that slaves couldn't be replaced without a constant flow from Africa. In the US, slaves had a fertility rate that was nearly 80% higher. 5. By 1825, the high fertility rate among slaves in the US led to nearly 1/4 of all black people in the New World living in the United States. 4. This also meant that by the 1800s, most slaves in the U.S. were much farther removed from their African roots than those in the Caribbean and South America. While slaves in the U.S. were third, fourth, and
We're not from Africa, we're not moved from African roots, we're moved from America, which is not called America at the time, it was called Turtle Island, and the islands we already was at, then y'all came over there and over here and took our shit and sold us for slaves.
other countries to end their slave trades as well, the internal slave trade.
We was already here. A lot of these lands are the old land. Some of these lands y'all didn't know about and couldn't get to, even when y'all did find out about them, and was warned not to go to them when y'all came. And many others came, you got their ass whooped, and y'all, left because you got sent packing. But you the only ones who kept coming back over and over and over again for some strange reason. No matter what we did to y'all.
Of the American South continued until the end of the Civil War in 1865. This finally abolished slavery within the U.S. 2. Although American slaves were meant to be free, Jim Crow laws and segregation prevented blacks from owning homes, being employed, and getting an education. It wasn't until November 2000 that Alabama finally became the last state to overturn its ban on interracial marriage. Although the U.S. Supreme Court had prevented Alabama from enforcing its law, the ban remained on books.
Why?
Although every single government on Earth has officially banned slavery, it still remains a huge problem. There are actually more slaves in the world today than ever before. By some estimates, up to 50 million people live in modern-day bondage. Most of these slaves are in southern Asia, over 20 million, but the rest of Asia, Eastern Europe, Africa, and the Middle East all have high levels of slavery as well.
Slavery, ethnic cleansing, the crimes with murder, kidnapping, slavery, ethnic cleansing, the crimes with murder, kidnapping, slavery, ethnic cleansing, the crimes with which Christopher Columbus might be charged today are reason enough for his reputation to lie in tatters. But his greatest act was to inaugurate a change so enormous and powerful and so transformative that it isn't considered a crime at all. Columbus made modern capitalism possible. To be clear, Columbus didn't invent double-entry bookkeeping or the maps that made global commerce and conquest possible. He wasn't even the first to apply slave labor to industrial plantations for profit. But what Columbus did do is open the imagination of Europe's great rulers and the bankers who financed them to something entirely unprecedented. The possibility not just of empire and not just riches, but global empire and global wealth. Columbus's disruptive idea involved persuading backers to lend the money so that he could navigate, claim, and exploit new frontiers across the planet. Columbus was also a creative manager, using a range of incentives to motivate his workers. On board the Nina, Pinta, and Santa Maria, he offered a silk doublet and a handsome annuity to the first person to see land. A sailor
Let's be clear, what he did was a crime and still is a crime.
named Rodrigo de Triana spotted the New World at 2 a.m. on October 12, 1492. Columbus kept the reward, which was delivered to him until he died, and it was funded by a tax on the butchers of Seville. The government was ever kind to Columbus, even though Columbus was never kind to his workers. Once he was in the Caribbean, the search for riches began in earnest. On the 8th day after landfall, he found a cape, and he recorded in his diary that he called it Cabo Hermoso, beautiful cape, because it is so. I can never tire my eyes in looking at such lovely vegetation, so different from ours. I believe that there are many herbs and many trees that are worth much in Europe for dyes and for medicines, but I do not know them, and this causes me great sorrow. He cast his eye on nature, and he was frustrated that he couldn't
When he came here to America,
He did, however, see money in the humans who were living in the New World. Columbus, having grown up in Genoa, where
when he
5%
came here
of the
to
population
America,
were slaves,
we're not
he knew
humans,
how to appraise the
okay?
people,
We
of
are
what he
what
was
the
taking
Bible
for
would
was
call
evil.
as man,
Columbus's second
although
voyage
we
was
don't
a
accept
colonial
that
one,
term.
with
We are
17 ships,
children
1,200
of the
men,
Creator by the
returning
Spirit.
gold, new flora and fauna, and indigenous Americans. Let us, in the name of the Holy Trinity, go on sending all the slaves that can be sold, Columbus wrote to Isabella and Ferdinand after a second voyage. Think of Columbus as a man who could talk to venture capitalists into
Welcome to Southwest Florida History Untold Stories. This time we'll be exploring the African American community. We're going back in time when segregation was the law of the land. We'll hear untold stories about pride, endurance, and victory. Join us as we learn about the development of the African American community in Southwest Florida. Meet some of its remarkable people and hear about their dreams, struggles, and contributions.
Our story of the African American community begins with recollections of the days of slavery and how those painful memories impacted future generations.
My grandmother would tell us about slavery, how hard it was, and when they brought them over here on the ship, and one man jumped off and was swimming in the water, and they shot and killed him. And it was so, it was, those things, when I was growing up a little girl, it worried me.
I feel a very personal connection with the whole aspect of slavery because I am the descendant of slaves. On my father's side, my great-grandfather, I knew of him, Thomas Russell, had been a slave. He lived 3 years after he was free, and I've always wondered what he did with those 3 years of his life that he knew freedom.
There were also positive stories, stories of friendship and unity.
Well, a lot of free runaway slaves hooked up with the Seminole Indians, and they retreated down to this area. And they learned how to live in this area in thatched roofs made out of palm fronds. They did some initial farming, did some initial ranching, had a lot of black cowboys.
In many cases, Indians were...
And now y'all say, why y'all do that? That was mixing. Actually, no, it wasn't. It was mixing with a different tribe, yeah. But they were actually part of the family. They followed the same laws and everything. The only difference between them and that's the particular tribe, because some of us died out here too. All right, they was dyeing their hair with natural resources, and it made the hair permanently, from the research I've done, I read up some research on this, stay that way. So they were black, dark-skinned like us. Some were light-skinned, you call your light-skinned people. Some, were dark-skinned, okay, as well. And there were some who didn't do that to their hair. You see pictures of feathers in their hair.
And they intermarried.
You wore feathers too as well.
I said on both sides. On my mother's side are Creek Indians, on my father's side are Cherokee. And I know that in Florida, in the history of Florida, that Creeks and blacks marrying helped to produce the Seminole tribes.
Family stories about slavery reflected individual experiences.
Black Seminole tribes.
But as time passed, many families moved on and looked forward.
To be fair, there wasn't too
Cherokee was
much
black already. Cherokee Indians was already black
because
as well.
when I came along, they were trying to get away from it. Sometimes they would talk, but the children could not listen. But they had to say they would send us in one room and they would talk about it. And I think it was because they didn't want us to know.
Slavery was not a conversation that really was addressed very much in my family, but my grandfather, maternal grandfather, told me that his mother was a slave, and she died sometimes in the early 1930s. But I never met her. I never got a chance to talk with her. So I don't really know firsthand. I've never met anybody firsthand that was a slave.
One of the reasons I think that slavery really wasn't a discussion for households of African Americans, especially during the early part of the century, because so many bad experiences were connected with slavery, especially for people in the South, in the Deep South. And it was just a topic that was better left not discussed.
After the Civil War was over and slaves were freed, African Americans in Southwest Florida established communities.
Of the 15 men who came to Florida initially, 7 of them were African American. They, of course, helped to do everything from digging up palm scrubs to just laying out the town and helping to develop that town. The history of the African American community in Fort Myers, Lee County, began with the settlement of Nelson Tillis and his family around 1869. And later, other African Americans came to the area.
We knew we were kicking the hornet's nest of a 43-year-old murder case that wasn't going to get the attention, and the truth wasn't going to come out, and the justice wasn't going to be found unless we kicked it often and hard. In 2004, I was working on a documentary about the Mississippi burning case. 3 civil rights workers, Schwerner, Cheney, and Goodman, who were murdered by the Klan on June 21st, 1964. And in the course of preparing to make that film, I had to do a lot of research. Looking through one of the films, I saw the image of a body being taken out of the river, and the narrator said something like, this was the wrong body, this wasn't the body of Schwerner, Cheney, or Goodman, and therefore the searchers moved on. And that was it. I'm like, wait a sec, I stopped to see that, I rewound it, played it again. Whose body is this that they found? Further research revealed that it was the body of Henry Dee. Henry Hezekiah Dee was a 19-year-old African-American from Meadville, Mississippi, who disappeared on May 2nd, 1964, along with his friend, another African-American named Charles Eddie Moore. So these 2 black youths were the wrong bodies, and the other 3 were the right bodies, and of course 2 of the 3 Mississippi burning victims were white. And I thought, I'm going to make a film about this. So I decided to find a family member to go with me. That led me to Thomas Moore, who was Charles Moore's brother. Thomas was a career Army Command Sergeant Major, and I was a career filmmaker, social activist. I was vegetarian, eating Cheerios in the car, and he was a big-time meat eater. It was an interesting relationship. We soon made our way down to Meadville, sort of doing a reenactment, which was kind of ridiculous, but we borrowed an old truck from a fellow who was standing watching us, and I drove the truck, and Thomas hitchhiked, and I pretended to be the Klansman. Then we went into the forest and tried to sort of reenact the beating, which we understood from FBI documents to have taken place with long poles where the boys were whipped, beaten, bloody and unconscious, and then eventually they were rolled into the back of a car and taken across the Mississippi River into Louisiana, where they were finally disposed of while still alive. We had somebody drive up and say in their southern drawl, you know, can we help y'all? What y'all doing? And we just said, well, we're fishing. And we looked behind us, and there's this, like, dried-up creek bed behind us. And they're like, you're fishing here? And we got some funny looks. Before we went down to Mississippi, we had read that all the Klansmen who had taken part in the Dee and Moore murders were dead, except for one, a guy named Charles Marcus Edwards. And he had been interviewed by Connie Chung, and he had been interviewed in newspapers about his role, and he always denied that he had anything to do with killing Charles Moore and Henry Dee. But he was alive, and we knew where he lived. Well, Charles Edwards lived in the Bunkley community, which was a well-known Klan hotspot, shall we say, in the southern U.S. In fact, it was probably the home of some of the most violent Klan members in U.S. history. And he still lived there, so Thomas and I decided that we would first try to call him. 2 or 3 or 4 attempts, and each time he hung up. On another occasion, we went to Edwards' house, and the plan was that Thomas would come out, and I would film Thomas trying to talk to Edwards. And we drove up, and Mr. Edwards was in his driveway. I got out, I had my camera ready, this dog lunged at me and was barking, and I turned around, Thomas wasn't there. So Thomas stayed in the van, and I walked up to talk to Edwards in his driveway, and I tried to get him to talk, and of course, he didn't. And he kicked me off his property, and I backed away, and we drove off, and Thomas revealed that he was just paralyzed with fear. He could not get out of the van. On another occasion, we decided, since Edwards was a deacon of a church in Bunkley, the Bunkley Baptist Church, which was a church actually built by the Klan, we decided that maybe being on the church grounds would somehow, allow Edwards to be more honest or to, be more amenable to talking. And we knew that he would arrive early to open the church. We drove back and forth on the Bunkley Road several dozen times. Finally, Edwards arrived at the church. We approached, and this time Thomas got out of the truck. They had a conversation, and Edwards, of course, denied that he had anything to do with killing Charles Moore, Thomas's brother, but when I asked him, did he have any role in picking them up, he went silent. He wouldn't answer that question. And I asked him several times, did you have something to do with picking those boys up, sir? And Edwards kept backing up and eventually kicked us off the property again. On one day, we decided to go for lunch to a place that Thomas knew. It was a gas station, actually, that made some great sandwiches. He had this massive sausage sandwich, and of course I'm eating like my Cheerios next to him. My feet up on the dashboard, and Thomas saw a guy he knew, in fact a relative named Kenny Bird. And Kenny came over to the car and said, Thomas, what are you doing here? And Thomas said, well, we're here working, the case of my brother. And Kenny said, yeah, I remember about that. And then Thomas said, it's too bad James Ford Seal is dead. And Kenny looked at him and said, what are you talking about? He lives right over there. And Kenny turns around and points across the road from us. And Thomas and I looked at each other and we're like, what? It's kind of silly because, everybody in the town kind of knew he was still alive, but the information just never got out. And in fact, Seal had been reported as dead by at least 2 or 3 main journalistic publications, so we had no inkling that he would be still alive. And he was a significant factor in the case. In fact, his family was known as a fairly violent family in the area, part of the Klan leadership for a long time. So we were excited, and we proceeded to drive by, and we found him down the hill living in an RV. Thomas decided that he wanted to try to approach Seal from a distance. So Thomas strode along the roadside and he yelled down at James Seal, who was sitting next to the RV at the time, that he wanted to talk to him. Why don't you come and talk to me like a man? And Seal just ran into his RV, just disappeared instantly. Thomas also began to run away for fear that Seal had gone inside to get a rifle. Seal ran into his RV, we ran away, got into our van, and got out of there. And after that, we decided to get the community involved and build up some support for confronting Seal. We put up signs throughout Franklin County, at the site where Dee and Moore were taken, at the site where Edwards lived, at the site of James Ford Seal's house, at the site where Charles Moore used to live. Thomas was military trained, and we adopted kind of military strategy. So we generally would not go down the same road twice in the same day. We wouldn't backtrack. We would stay in hotel rooms and stay at the back of the hotel. We would never park in the front. We were careful about giving out our names. We always had each other's back. Of course, I was a white guy, and he was a black guy, and he was able to speak to Mississippi blacks in a way that I could never do, and I could speak to people who were white in the community in a way that he felt he could never do. We would kind of use that to our advantage. Discovering that James Ford Seal was still alive was just a small blip in the case. There was still a huge load of work to do if the case was ever to find justice. And Thomas and I knew that. Really, we had to get Charles Edwards to start talking in order to get anywhere with the case. When we confronted him at the church, we knew that we had him on the question of whether he had had anything to do with picking the boys up. Right afterwards, we called the U.S. attorney that we'd been talking to, Dunn Lampton, and told him what we had done. And Lampton said, thanks very much for telling me, and apparently, according to Lampton, a couple of weeks later, he was down there talking to Edwards, and Edwards confessed. It was Charles Edwards' idea, in fact, to kidnap Henry Dee on May 2nd, 1964. Henry Dee had come under suspicion by Edwards and the rest of the Klan because he wore a headscarf to protect his hair process. He was straightening his hair. And also, Henry had traveled back and forth to Chicago to visit his aunt, and there were some fears amongst Klansmen that there was an insurrection brewing amongst blacks and that guns were being brought into the county, and that somehow there was a connection to Chicago. We knew from the documents, and as he would admit later, Edwards helped pick the boys up and was one of the main guys beating them bloody and unconscious in the woods before others would take them off to Louisiana to actually kill them. Eventually, there was enough evidence the Department of Justice decided that they would pull the trigger. turned out that Edwards had agreed to testify against Seal as the star witness in exchange for immunity. Edwards testified in court that he and James Seal had participated in the kidnapping and beating of Charles Moore and Henry Dee, and that he knew that Seal and the other Klansmen had gone on to murder Dee and Moore over in Louisiana, because sometime later he heard Seal confessing to another Klansman about what had happened later that night. During the trial, as the jury was deliberating, someone had placed a package and called it a bomb and called it into the police right near my van. So they locked down the streets in Jackson, Mississippi, several blocks around the courthouse and around the hotel. They brought in the bomb disposal guy. They said that the box was filled with racist epithets and names of people. They never were able to tell me whose names were written in the box. So I think probably an attempt to disrupt the trial. Moments later, the jury returned with a unanimous decision that Seal was guilty on all counts. 2 counts of kidnapping with a special finding that the victims were not liberated unharmed, along with 1 count of Klan conspiracy, 3 concurrent life sentences. During the trial, Charles Edwards stood up when the jury was absent and asked the Dee and Moore families for forgiveness for his role in the case. And that kind of stunned the courtroom and also the family of Charles Moore and Henry Dee. Thomas Moore was kind of dumbfounded as what to do. Should I forgive this guy? I just said you have to follow what your gut says. 4 years later, after the trial, Thomas Moore and I decided that we would go back to Mississippi and try to speak to Edwards again and try to get him to talk about the case and about this idea of forgiveness. Thomas, I think, was ready at this time. So we drove down to Mississippi, down the old Bunkley Road, past the church where we confronted Edwards so many years ago, and walked up Edwards' driveway, and there he was, standing there fixing his boat in the back of his house. So we walked up to Edwards, and Edwards welcomed us, and he didn't know we were coming. Edwards and Thomas sat together on the back porch in this swinging chair and talked about the case, and Edwards admitted what he had done and told in great detail what happened, and finally, at the end, Charles Edwards invited Thomas Moore to his church. And of course, this is the same church that was built by the White Knights of the Ku Klux Klan members, including James Seal. Thomas accepted, and then they went to the church the next day. Charles Edwards and Thomas Moore sat together and sang in this church that was built by the Klan. Thomas was the only black person in attendance. He was probably the only black person ever to attend that church. It was a very surreal moment.
The Democratic Party prides itself on being inclusive and advocating for communities of color. But there was a time when racism was at the center of its policies.